So everyone, science writing, week 3. Remember that there's two components to this class, in English and for impact. And over the 5-week lecture series, some weeks are more about the English aspect, like last week, how to structure your writing. It was very focused on the English writing. This week is strategy, and this week is a little more about how to raise the impact level of your paper. And if if you believe your work is of high impact, how to strategize, how to take the right strategy to make sure it has a good chance at a high impact journal. Okay. As before, this lecture series would not exist without the mutual encouragement, Gongmian, of Wu Feiyan Lao She, Peng Peng Lao She, and Zhao Liang Lao She. Here are some photos of Peng Peng Lao She and I in 2010 when we were young men working up in northern Canada. Here at some beautiful Precambrian dikes exposed not far from Ottawa. And thank you to you. Okay. The first week we had over 700 people, second week over 600 people. And thanks for a strong first 2 weeks. I've received a lot of feedback by email and Weixin. So if you have a short question, you can speak up at the end of this, but also feel free to contact me later. Just remember our metaphor here for why the writing process is so important. Okay. Do not underestimate how much of science is writing when you think about the whole process of science. We learn a lot of things, but rarely writing. But your career depends on your ability to write. So I ask you the question, what percentage of the whole process of science is writing? And I argue surprisingly large. And most importantly, it's the last critical steps. So today, last week, we talked a lot about how to get to submission in terms of structuring your paper. But there's some other things you need to think about at the last step of submission. And more importantly, something we haven't talked about last week is really dealing with the review and the revision process, which are literally the last few steps between your paper being published and not being published. Okay, so we're kind of moving our way up Mount Everest, getting closer to the summit this week. Okay. And remember the whole structure of the 5 weeks. The first week, we talked about philosophy of writing, very general ways to improve your writing. Second week, last week, we delved into very important structure, very specific ways to structure your writing to improve your writing. And this third week, we'll talk about strategy, big things for big journals, things like cover letters, things like decision letters, reviewers. And next week, we'll get very, very specific on some little tricks, little things that make a big difference. Okay. So I won't waste time on that now. That's next week. And finally, what will be my favorite is the questions you have all had. I will want time to think about and assimilate collective responses to your questions. And questions can be about any of the things you learned in lectures 1 through 4. Or questions you already had. They can even be points of disagreement. If you have a different approach that works for you, I would love to know what it is, and maybe others, your colleagues, should know too. Again, great feedback, as Zhang Wei said, the last 2 weeks. So please keep it up. We might not have time, just a warning, I have a lot to get to today, so we might not have time to deal with your questions today. So make sure you remember what they are, and please email me or type in the chat window and I can look at them later. 谢谢. And I'll repeat this again and again. Take it or leave it. This is my advice from my personal perspective. What works for me may not work for you. Everyone needs to find his or her own style. Some of the advice I give may be helpful. 太棒了. Some advice may not be helpful. 没问题. You will benefit no matter what from thinking about it. And sometimes we will give different approaches. Maybe you prefer one over the other. Maybe one approach works for one paper and another approach for another paper. So take it or leave it, but think about it. And I mentioned this before in the first lecture, but it's very important, as you will see, for today, for strategy. Review, review, review. Once you have submitted to a journal, you will be in the journal's database for reviewing, okay? And once you're at this step, this may be more relevant for postdocs, for young associate professors. Once you have this possibility, take it. Do not be afraid. Other non-native speakers struggle with writing, and even native speakers struggle too. And reviewing is a responsibility. I remind you of the Li Jianxiang rule. He says, review one paper for every 3 you submit. Every paper you get reviews from, there's 3 reviewers, okay? So this is where his rule comes from. For every 1 paper you submit, you should review at least 3. Of course, if you're reviewing too many papers, you might be wasting some time. But don't think of those 3 papers for every 1 you submit. Don't think of it as a waste of time. It offers a privilege of advanced knowledge of new work. And what's important for today is the 2 points here in bold. Reviewing provides an inside view into why papers get accepted or rejected. And we'll talk about this today, provides practice thinking like a reviewer. We'll talk a lot about what that means. And one thing from last week that is very, very relevant this week to strategy is Brendan Murphy's concept of 1 paper, 1 idea. Brendan Murphy was a geology editor, an editor at Geology for many years. He handled thousands of papers, I believe, and learned a lot about this basic concept. You can only present and test 1 idea, 1 new idea in a paper. If you have another idea, save the other idea for another paper. It's not to be confused with one method, for example, data or modeling. If you need both data and modeling to justify your idea, you can use them both. But you cannot present, you cannot test 2 ideas in 1 paper. This gives reviewers too much to criticize. This mistake of putting more than 1 idea makes it too easy for reviewers to find something wrong. And if an editor sees more than 1 big problem, they get very worried and your paper is rejected. Now, once we talked about how to get your 1 idea, and we'll talk about that more based on some of the questions I got. But let's assume you have your 1 idea for your 1 paper. Now strategy is journal selection, okay? Of course, I want to encourage you to be optimistic. I want to encourage you to try for Nature Index journals. As scientists, we should always strive to be on the frontier, pushing the limits of understanding. So I want you to be optimistic. But the other side of the coin is you also need to be realistic. Let's face it, everyone thinks their own research is interesting. The trick is thinking objectively about how important your work not is just to you, but to other people. And let's face it, let's be realistic. Nature Index requires a lot. It requires rigorous data. It requires rigorous data analysis. It requires very clear, understandable figures. It requires very good writing, and that writing isn't just about the paper, it's about the cover letter too. And we'll talk about that today. And Nature Index also requires the ability to convince editors and reviewers, the review process. We'll talk about that today. And editors and reviewers, this is why it's difficult. Okay. Editors have very limited space. Their job is rejecting papers. Very few times are they actually accepting papers in these top journals. And reviewers are going to be jealous of your work. If you thought of something that they didn't think of in a field that they know a lot about, we're all human. So keep in mind that reviewers will be jealous of your work. And so you have to overcome editors that have to reject papers, and you have to overcome reviewers that will be jealous that you thought of something that they didn't think of. And experience will develop the feel of a journal. The more papers you read, the more papers you review, the more papers you submit, you will get a feel for what type of journal you should be selecting. I remember Dave Evans, my advisor, he had or Li Zhangshang, my supervisor at Curtin, both of them had a very good feel for what was a geology paper. So I'd give them a result and they would say, that's perfect for a geology paper. And reading. We talked about this week one, probably talked about it last week. Find the highest profile paper on the topic you are contributing to. That journal may consider publishing again. They may consider if you can really prove that you advance beyond the last time they published on that topic, but much more likely, be realistic. Much more likely, you'll have to go one level down. So maybe if Nature Geoscience published on your topic last year, they're less likely to publish again on the same topic. So you're more likely to have success, say, at Nature Communications. It's not say it's not worth trying, but being realistic is something important, especially for students that have limited time to get papers published. And we'll go back to writing, but I do want to spend a couple slides just talking about the power of visuals. Pretty pictures sell. You cannot overstate the importance of good looking figures, and just be realistic. Compare your figures to those in the journal you're submitting. Are your figures as nice looking as the journal you're submitting to? Is there a similar style? You can look at, Nature's formatting and the very specific things, even Nature Communications, very specific protocols. Just for example, lines are very thin, nothing thicker than 0.5 points. Very limited use or no use of bold or italic font. Use sans serif font. So the Times New Roman font, you see these little tick marks at the edges of each font. That's a serif, and serif fonts are very good for reading a lot of text. So all these journals, the text will be in serif font, but for figures, just like advertisements you see on the street or on TV, figures will use sans serif fonts. They jump out at you. So when there's less text, it's easier to read. And really the basic question, if you're going at a top journal, what is your one figure? Okay. Not saying it's not the most important. All of your figures are obviously important. The map, the data, the interpretation. But typically these top journals, the last figure, kind of like the graphical abstract in other papers, in other journals, is there one figure that tells the whole story? And in that one figure, is the conceptual change, is the conceptual advance clear? So I just give an example from published in Nature this year, where many papers had talked about the Great Oxygenation Event, and this paper was changing the concept to the Great Oxygenation Episode, where it's a more protracted, more dynamic period of time, not so much a short-lived event. And you can see that very easily. They have several data sets, but in a couple seconds, you can see very clearly, oh, this is different than the past. And this is a figure that will be cited. It will be in a lot of people's PPTs, and it will change thinking. So if you don't have a one figure, you either need to think about how to make one, or you need to think about maybe I need to pick something else for my journal selection. And here's a recommendation. You don't have, it's not absolutely necessary, but in many cases, I've found it's a really nice first step that doesn't seem like it's very useful, but you'll be surprised. Try just drawing your figures by hand before you open Adobe Illustrator, before you open CorelDRAW, Photoshop, however you make your final figures. Just draw the figure. Okay, so here I give an example with me and Wang Chong in my office using the whiteboard, and very surprisingly, in this little sketch on the left, you actually see two of our figures for the geology paper. So the figure on the bottom that ends up becoming, showing the concept of a megacontinent within a larger supercontinent. Believe it or not, that figure was just in the bottom left. This circle and this circle within a circle. So that was, hey, figure one, we need one image that everyone can just look at and see what a megacontinent is relative to a supercontinent. So that was easy. And then the other one was the timeline. And there are elements of the drawing and the final version that are different, but it really helps. And actually, very few things changed. And as you'll see, the timeline has Laurentia, Candia, Gondwana, Eurasia. It has the megacontinents before the supercontinents. And we knew we wanted a timeline, and we knew we wanted the paleogeography, side by side. So having this to go off of, this drawing takes 5 minutes. The final figure may take 5 days. So it's quick and easy. It makes you focus on the content, not the technical things about the data and the drafting. It makes you focus on the main features of the data, the image, and it keeps the figure as simple as possible from the beginning. Okay. And here's just another example, of why drawing your figures by hand is helpful. This is on a paper I'm working with Liu Chanzhou. And we knew we wanted kind of a one figure summary. And we actually wanted to have an artist make a nice version of it. And so just hand draw it. And then it's very easy, especially if you're working with an artist that may not be a geologist. This was a nice step. So, keep in mind, I'll share this in the cover letters later. Making nice figures are not only for the papers, but can also be used in the cover letters. Now you got your one idea, you got your figures. We already talked about paper structure. What's some basic strategy to get your papers published in rigorous journals? Well, the main difference between a Nature Index journal and not a Nature Index journal is the rigor of the review process. You're going to get the best scientists in the field reviewing your papers. So you really need to learn how to think like a reviewer. Ideally, you learn how to do this better and better over time, okay? And it's the ability to step away from your work and think like a reviewer. But this is hard. We all, as I said, we all like our own research, and we like the way that we understand it. But other readers, other reviewers may understand it differently. So it's nice if you can find a co-author that can serve in this capacity, kind of act like a reviewer for you, because it's better to hear criticism from a friend than hear it after review, after a decision has already been made. And if you have a colleague who's not a co-author, who will be unavailable to review your paper, you can ask them for an informal review. This is very helpful because it's kind of like a practice at peer review, but you can also use this to your advantage in the cover letter. And I'll mention more on that later. And find your Paul Hoffman. I've talked about Paul Hoffman in the lectures before, especially week 1. I've co-authored a few papers with Paul, but quite often he's either contributed but doesn't wish to be a co-author because he doesn't feel like contributing too much, or I just know that he's knowledgeable and want his opinion. And you know, he's a good colleague, he's a good friend, but he knows that when I send him a manuscript, the most help that he can be is not telling me, "Oh, what a great idea, Ross. This is so cool." His most helpful capacity is being critical, being a reviewer for me before I get the reviews. So I heard a story from one of his students, Adam Maloof, who I've mentioned, and Adam told me that no matter how many times, no matter how many drafts he would give Paul as his advisor, every time the new draft came back, it came back with 20 new comments. Then the second draft, 20 new comments. Then the third draft, 20 new comments. So Paul understands the rigor of review, and those that he's trying to mentor and trying to help, he acts like an informal review. So thinking like a reviewer avoids issues before they come up in review. You may, once you get better at this, you may want to present your idea a certain way, but through experience, you'll learn that if you present it slightly differently, it might be more convincing to someone who is less easily convinced than yourself. And thinking like a reviewer also helps with journal selection, okay? If you can step away from your work, imagine if I were the reviewer of this paper, not the author, would I feel comfortable it being published in Geology? Would I feel if I got this paper as review, do I think it's good enough for a Nature Geoscience? So thinking like a reviewer, I forgot to say this, but it even makes your science better because it's a different way of being critical about your own work. And it helps a lot with strategy for all these reasons. Okay, the art of the cover letter. The cover letter might be one of the main reasons why a paper is not reviewed at a Nature Index journal. It's the first thing that a reviewer, it's the first thing that an editor will read, okay? So first impressions matter. Okay, so at any Nature Index journal, writing a strong cover letter is absolutely essential to getting a chance for review. You know, put yourself in the shoes of the editor. help them help you. And what do I mean by that? At Nature and Science, the job of the geoscience editor is to argue that your paper deserves consideration given the competition with the other fields, physics, biology, chemistry. And at the next level down, at NG, at Science Advances, PNAS, geology, the job of the assigned editor is to argue that your paper deserves consideration given the competition with the best papers in geoscience. And very often, the papers at these journals are papers that were just rejected at Nature and Science. So they're very, very good. You're up against a lot of competition. So the cover letter is all about helping the editor. Give them the ammunition they need for battle. What do I mean by that? They're going to enter the editorial board meeting, and at Nature and Science, they're arguing with the other editors of the other sciences, physics, biology, chemistry. At Nature Geoscience, they're arguing with the other editors who have been assigned other papers. When they go in that meeting, their best arguments for your paper will come from you. They don't have time to think and make up better arguments for you. It's all up to you. So they need the clearest and the most exciting arguments, and you need to give those to them. They can't be expected to come up with arguments that you don't make yourself. Now, this is just very, very basic. Number one, do not copy sentences from your abstract and your introduction. This is redundant. The editor will definitely, likely read both the abstract and the introduction too, when making their decision to send it out for review. If they read the same sentence twice, they feel like you're wasting their time. Instead, this is the real reason why you don't just copy. The cover letter is an opportunity a real big opportunity to speak in less technical and more accessible terms about the importance of your work. In the main paper, you can talk a little bit, you have to, a little bit about why it's really important. But sometimes there's kind of unstated importance that's not stated so much clearly in the paper that you can state in the cover letter. Think, for example, of the Chang'e papers, the first moon samples collected in 44 years. That's definitely something that you say in a cover letter, but in a scientific paper, it's good to have new samples, but it's a little unscientific to talk about that, oh, it's been 44 years since we had a sample return. So sometimes knowing what importance is appropriate for the paper and what is appropriate for the cover letter is a great step to figure out what your cover letter should be about. Save it for the cover letter. And you can have a little more fun in a cover letter. You can use slightly more colorful, slightly less formal language than is typically allowed in scientific writing, with that example from Chang'e Wu. And the fundamental question, is, can the editor get a biologist excited about their work? So that's why it needs to be less technical. If you just use technical terms that even some geologists won't understand, the wider audience of scientists just won't follow. It needs to be accessible. So I want to go through an example cover letter. And so here's the example on the right. This was a paper of mine that did go out for a review at Nature. So it was rejected, but for our purposes here, I'm teaching you first of all to get a chance. And to be reviewed, you need obviously the technical details need to seem sound, but also the appeal needs to be significant enough for nature. So I'll go through paragraph by paragraph this example and why it might have been a successful cover letter. So cover letters they can't be too long, but they also can't be too short. The length needs to be just right. If it's too long, the editor might not have time to read it, and the most important things will be lost. If it's too short, then they will wonder if you don't have anything you can say about why it's important. So in this example, it's a one-page single-spaced document. Whether you want to double space it, that's your decision. But this is a guideline. Your cover letter should be about this long. It could be shorter, it could be a little bit longer, but generally, this is a nice guideline. And it may or may not include references. So you'll notice that this one does have references. If you do include references, it's a nice way to kind of increase the importance of your paper by association. So if you do include references, they better be references on the level of the journal that you're submitting. So if you're submitting to a Nature Index journal, they should be Nature Index level references that you're citing. And generally, we're going to follow a 3 or 4 paragraph structure, and I'll go through paragraph by paragraph. Don't waste space in your cover letter on reviewer suggestions. There's a place for that in the submission portal. Don't use that space here. Check the journal for requirements for the cover letter. I'll talk about that in the last paragraph. And, basically, have a nice letterhead and don't use any silly fonts. Those are obvious. So paragraph 1, have a clear first sentence to grab their attention. So I'll actually read this. My first sentence here is, in order for the supercontinent cycle to repeat, a supercontinent must somehow be able to break apart. It's a little more exciting than, say, writing you would have in a scientific paper. It's a little more informal, but it grabs the reader right away. Oh, this is about the supercontinent cycle, and it's about how to break a supercontinent apart, and it tells the editor that we may not know how to do that. So they're interested not only in the topic, but also the problem. And then the next sentence really elaborates how you can use colorful but still accurate language. And it reads, the breakup of supercontinent Pangaea gives us the 6 lonely continents scattered around the globe today. Yet even as well known as the breakup of Pangaea may be, again, these are ways of writing that are a little more colorful, a little more exciting than you get to do in your scientific paper. But this is the cover letter. This is what they're going to be talking about with their colleagues in the editorial meeting. So you can be a little more exciting. And then the first paragraph really contains a couple critical things. Not only giving the editor the necessary background to understand the problem, but really laying the foundation for why the problem needs your solution in your paper. So just a few of the examples that I'll point out is that there are physical mechanisms, but they're not agreed upon, that there's numerous candidate sources of stress, okay? That means that there are proposals, but no consensus. And then I use a phrase, it's typically assumed. That means that I'm going to be questioning that assumption. And then, I end with this, people assume that it's merely a question of comparing the magnitude of these known stresses. So as you'll see, I'm setting up the nature of the problem as it exists, but also kind of foreshadowing, forecasting, and hinting of where our solution will come in. So that's the second paragraph. And if you can think of the first paragraph as kind of like the first half of your abstract, remember the structure of the abstract from last week. And then the second paragraph of the cover letter is the very similar to the second half of your abstract that starts with the "here we" statement. And follow through with your solution. You just set up the problem and you kind of hinted what your solution might be, and then come right in with what it is. So here in dark green, I say a source of significant stress for supercontinent breakup that is currently not being considered. So remember, I set it up that there were proposed ideas, but no consensus, and people assumed that they had identified all the possible sources of stress. But here we come in with our solution. Here's a source of stress that is not being considered. So you set the problem up and follow through with your solution. And this is the cover letter. It's okay to kind of brag or boast a little bit, because remember, the editor needs to be able to show how great your paper is to the other editors. So here we use a phrase that we wouldn't use in the paper, but we use it here. We say that such an analysis of deformation on Earth with this mechanism has not been conducted for decades. I would argue that's inappropriate in a scientific paper, but for the cover letter, it's perfect. And, highlight, this is maybe obvious, highlight the strengths of your paper. So in the very beginning of this paragraph, I let the editor know this is both evidence and modeling. Okay. One of the highlights of this paper is that I brought the evidence and my co-author brought the modeling. And so I emphasize that in the beginning of the "here we" paragraph, and then at the end of the "here we" paragraph, I show both the evidence and both the modeling, the 1-2. And another example of colorful language, there's going to be a little less colorful language in the second paragraph because it's closer to, just scientifically reporting your results. And we say these stresses occurred in the right place at the right time. That's very easily understandable language for the cover letter that wouldn't be appropriate for the main paper. And finally, the third paragraph, this is the simplest one, so I'll go a little quickly. You must start with an explicit claim that the work is of wide interest. So here we say, with implications for both Earth and planetary science, the paper should be of wide interest to Nature readers. So in that sentence, you kind of explain why, if you already haven't, why it's of wide interest. It's Earth and planetary. And we mentioned thinking like a reviewer and having people like Paul Hoffman or respected colleagues that are not co-authors read your paper like a reviewer. This helps get the editor's attention. So I say, our colleague Joe Kirschvink, Caltech, has reviewed the work and finds it compelling. This is going to get the editor's attention. Joe Kirschvink is a co-author of mine. I can't use him as a reviewer, so why not use him in the capacity of an informal reviewer? And, here's an example. You may feel uncomfortable with this, but you can have a little fun with the editor. They are bored. And here I actually make a joke, and they might actually repeat that joke. So I said, the Kirschvink found our work compelling and groundbreaking. He insisted on this pun, but it's also its substance. So we're talking about how to break up a supercontinent, and I use the phrase groundbreaking. So, it's okay to, have a little fun with these cover letters, and I hope that was a good example. And then the last paragraph, just read all the statements and information that are required by the journal. You can go through this on your own. The specific thing for Nature is space. So they want to know the number of words, the figures, and how much space it'll fill and how many pages. And one other thing that you can think about with your cover letter is cover letter art. Okay. You cannot overstate the importance of pretty pictures, as we said. And as the phrase goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. One thing you can do is have an artistic rendition of a figure. It's a great way to kind of catch the editor's eye. So here are two examples, one that got reviewed at Science and another that got reviewed at both Nature and Nature Geoscience, where we use some space on the cover letter to actually have this very appealing, eye-catching dimension. And I'll also point out the top example, Liu Qianzhou and I used Jun Kurinaga in a similar capacity as the example from Kirschvink. We were able to provide us feedback that not only improved the manuscript, it also allowed us to maybe catch the editor's attention. And oh wow, these guys are so serious about their paper. They even sent it already to a world leader in this field as a check to see that they're not wasting our time. But you know, this image, you can use cover letter art, but it doesn't replace having a good letter, which we just talked about. Now, I'll just read this because reviewer selection is really important, but it's really difficult. So I'll give some advice, but it's really hard to give advice that's too reliable. In general, just be very practical. I have learned this. Be practical. Do not recommend people's whose minds you want to change. I have learned this personally the hard way. Scientists are very conservative, and they're much more likely to be swayed by a published paper. So get it published first, and then after they read your paper, hopefully they change their mind. So why do I mention this practical thing? Exclusions are important, if not, they're as important, if not more important than the reviewers you include. So exclude reviewers potentially with opposing views and just cite conflict of interest. And Rebecca Neely, Nature Geoscience at Shanghai, she insisted that exclusions are honored. They want the review process to be fair, just like you. She also mentioned that they might only select one or two of the reviewers you suggest, but getting reviewers is so difficult for editors. So you might get your wish if you're careful about how you select them. So I'll just give you an example of one that really worked out well. This is a paper that got minor revisions at Geology just yesterday, actually. And I couldn't believe it. 2, maybe even 3 of our 5 recommendations were selected. So the ones in bold were the 2 that were named that I know were selected. And there's 2 in italics, okay? And I knew only likely one of those 2 would be selected, but not both of them. They're on similar papers. So it was very unlikely to have 3 selected. So the odds of one of those 2 being selected is low, and certainly not both of them are going to be selected. So in a way, this was my way. Those 2 in italics was my way of avoiding 2 critical reviews, which can kill a paper. And then I listed Daniel Veit, Johns Hopkins, only listing 1 strictly metamorphic petrologist increased the chances that they might actually be selected. So there was a 3rd reviewer selected. I'm not sure who it was, but it's possible that it was Daniel Veit. So it's possible that maybe all 3 reviewers came from our suggestions in this example. And the other positive thing about this reviewer selection example was I can be sure that the editor actually excluded and honored the exclusions that we recommended. So it works out. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Most importantly, it's a very critical step that you really want to put some thought into. You don't want to think about it 10 minutes before you're submitting and you just start WeChatting with your co-authors. This is something you should start thinking about earlier in the process because it's such a critical part. Now, understanding decision letters. This is important because decision letters are not always the final word. There's, as we'll see, there's some flexibility. So most Nature index journals do not have the concept of major revisions in name, but they do have, obviously, the concept. This is largely driven by metrics. They're competing. They want to have a high rejection rate and a fast turnaround time. So geology will actually treat your resubmission as a new submission, just so they can say they rejected it already, even though they're going to accept it. And so the time of the new manuscript is shorter than the whole revision process. So here are 3 examples of how different journals let you know the letters that leave the door open just a crack for resubmission. The way Nature says it is that we cannot accept the manuscript in its present form. The way that Science and Science Advances says this is the reviews were not positive enough to make the manuscript competitive for our limited space. And the way Geology says it is, although I would eventually like to be able to publish a paper on this topic in Geology, I am rejecting it at this time, pending revision. So, a little more explicit as you go down, but they're all saying basically the same thing, major revisions. So you can try and resubmit. You have a chance at a Nature Index paper, and you don't always have that chance. But keep in mind, this will take time, and you really have to change the manuscript. Don't just argue with the reviewer. So another lesson came from Brendan Murphy with all of his experience at Geology. You really have to change the manuscript, not just argue with the reviewer. Editors want to see what action was taken. And Geology even prefers to see changes in the main text, not just the supplement. Sometimes, Nature Geoscience, they may be okay with you adding something to Geology. Really, they want the paper to be very coherent without the supplement. So they want to see changes in the main text. And Brendan gave me this great recommendation, an easy way to show the editor and the reviewer, more importantly, the editor, that you've taken action. You can split your response to reviewer comments into one response section and a revision section, okay? So the response is, oh, we appreciate the comment and here's your thinking about it. And then go to a different color where you actually say how you revised the manuscript. This is an easy way for reviewers to know and editors to know if you actually changed the manuscript or if you're just arguing. And it's also an easy way of knowing how you respond. So sure, most of the cases you'll have a response and a revision, 2 parts, but sometimes you may have a revision or you may have a response, but it's one or the other. So, the examples of just revision I give here, if you just have language edits, for example, or the example I give here, both the editor and the reviewer had problems with the title. This is so important that you don't even want to argue in a response form. You just go straight to the revision. To address this reviewer's concern, we have taken editor's suggestion. Da, 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 da. Just tell them that you made a change. And then sometimes, as you know, reviewers make a suggestion that's interesting, but it really, you either disagree or it's not within the scope of the paper. So the example here, the editor said, "Oh, perhaps expect warming episodes from large impacts and when this could occur." And we said, this is certainly an interesting thought experiment, but this topic is beyond the scope of the paper. So in this instance, there's a response, but there is no revision. However, use just responses without revisions. Use them very, very sparingly. Again, it's about taking action, not arguing. And words matter, okay? Word choice, especially in titles and terminology, are critical. These are the words that the reviewers and the readers will be super sensitive to. What the words you use in the title and the terminology you use, you have to get it right. So in the review process, you want to be a little flexible. And I'll give an example. Well, just before the example, it's one of the easiest ways to address a reviewer comment is to change just the words. You're not changing your figures. You're not changing your analysis. You're not changing your results, really. You're changing the words to describe your method, your result, your implications. So the example I give is a reviewer at our Nature Geoscience paper really didn't like the word magmatic gap, and they actually offered to us an alternative of a magmatic lull. So magmatic gap had been the term that had been used before by Kent Condy. So there was a reason why we used it, but the reviewer had a point. There were some rock records that indeed had gaps, but there were other rock records that we looked at, like zircon, that had a very low amount of zircon, but there wasn't a gap, but it was a lull. So this isn't just semantics. This isn't just words. Actually, using lull instead of gap was actually more accurate, and it really improved the testability of our hypothesis. If you use the word gap, then anyone finding one rock in the world of that age thinks that they disproved your hypothesis. But by using the word lull to disprove our hypothesis, someone would actually have to argue that the amount of tectonomagmatic activity at this time was statistically not anything less than normal. So words matter, and here's an opportunity, an example where the review process really helped us out a lot by compromising with the reviewer. And sorry, there's a lot of words, but once you have your revisions, the revision cover letter, just some basic points. You highlight the main points to help the editor know up front what the big issues that were addressed. And the point-by-point responses that we just showed, those will come later and be better received if the first stage with the letter is set. And you can use bullet points like I do in this example, or you can use separate paragraphs for each main issue or separate paragraphs for each of the reviewers. But above all, do not get into too much detail in the revision cover letter. You want to give the impression that your work has improved, but that it hasn't changed too much. And always worry about the most critical reviewer the most. This is the reviewer that it will be sent back to. They probably won't bother all of the reviewers. So you need to address all the reviewers, but you'll see in this example, I really only talk about reviewer 4 because the other, well, this is an easy example because the other reviewers basically signed off. But even if there were 2 reviewers that kind of had issues, you do want to lead with the reviewer that was potentially pointing out a fatal flaw. Okay. And an example of showing how your work can improve but not change too much. You see how I say in red, we added a short but critical description of the sedimentology. Okay, so you're saying, giving the editor the appearance that the work is better off because of the review that they solicited, but you also give them the confidence that your original result is still stands. And that's important because your original result is why they sent the paper out to begin with. And I'll just finish today about life after rejection. Okay. Rejection is a major part of a career in publishing. So get used to it. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. When we work out our muscles, for example, the only reason they grow stronger is because we actually wear them down, break them down. So when they grow back, they grow stronger. Life goes on. So give yourself some time to grieve. What do I mean by that? Almost never submit to a new journal immediately. Give yourself a couple days, maybe even a week, to discuss with your co-authors what the next best plan of action is. Getting reviewed is a blessing and an asset, even when it ends up in rejection. So use the reviews to avoid trouble during your next round. New reviewers will likely have similar problems if you don't fix them from the first round. You may even very likely get the same reviewer. So don't insult their effort. I have seen a reviewer literally copy and paste their review because the authors just resubmitted their paper without revising. You've been given a window into how the community will see your work. So it's a real opportunity to improve it. And, being reviewed and rejected hurts, but sometimes it's not always wasted. Okay, Nature, AGU, GSA, they all have a portfolio of journals, some of which are all in Nature Index. And sometimes editors will make arrangements for you. So I give 2 examples. One example that was desk rejected by Nature Geoscience, rejected without review, but the editor liked it enough that they arranged review for the paper at Nature Communications. So I could submit it to NC knowing that it would go out to review. And the second example was frustrating because it was rejected after 2 rounds of review at Nature Geoscience, but the editor, understanding the rigor with which the paper had been subjected to, actually arranged acceptance in principle at Nature Communications. And there are journals, Terra Nova will actually make decisions based on your responses to reviews in geology. Innovation will make decisions based on reviews at Science and Nature to use that and not waste that time. So above all, 加油, rejection is real. It can be avoided if you use some of the strategies we discussed today. But you got to keep trying, and practice makes perfect. So thank you, 谢谢. We don't have time for questions today, really. So I look forward to hearing from you by email or Wisheen. So thank you, everybody.